morning, everyone. My name is Joel Miller. I'm kidding. So, my name is Gabriel Santos, and welcome to our Fear and Fungi, the Science of Last of Us panel. So this panel is really cool. We've got a bunch of really amazing scientists and science experts up here. And to get things started, I want to introduce who we are. First of all, this panel is part of a network. We are called the Steam Pop Network. We focus on science, pop culture, and inspiration. And this is a partnership between If Then, Cosplay for Science, Star Warsology, and the Fleet Science Center. We've got a bunch of really cool science panels all throughout Comic-Con this year. So check out that QR code and you can find out where you can find our other panels. And also, because of everything going on, we just want to say that we are supporting the WGA's strikers and SAG-AFTRA. Without them, we would not have the Last of Us panel today. So we want to support them and know that we really appreciate all the things they've done to give us this amazing fandom. So let's give them a round of applause. With that, we will just be focusing on the science today. We won't go into any of the story elements and things like that. So just keep that in mind as we go through and if we have questions later. So yes, Fear and Fungi, the Science of the Last of Us. This panel is brought to you by Cosplay for Science specifically. Cosplay for Science is a science education initiative founded by a bunch of scientists who really love talking about and connecting folks to the science and their favorite fandoms and their favorite shows or whatnot. Science is a part of all of those amazing narratives. It's woven in there, and we love to bring it out and show it to you. So if you want to check out Cosplay for Science, we'll be around the whole panel, or the whole con, and you can also find us at the Steam Fair, which we'll talk about later today. Like I said, we have a bunch of really amazing scientists on the panel today, so let's go ahead and get started with introducing everybody. So I will be your moderator today. My name is Gabriel Santos. I am the... I was like, okay, I'll stop talking. Okay. So I am the founder, or the co-founder of Cosplay for Science. I am also a paleontologist by training. I am a science storyteller. I am a Grosvenor Teacher Fellow with National Geographic. Basically, I love to tell stories, whether it's about dinosaurs or natural history or dragons and Dungeons and Dragons. That is my shtick. So I'm really happy to kind of moderate things today. And why don't we start with you, Justin? And we'll just go down the line.
Sure, thanks. Really happy to be here. My name is Justin Shaffer. I'm a researcher at University of California, San Diego, and I'm a mycologist, fungal ecologist by training. In addition to loving everything having to do with fungi and being completely enamored by them, I'm super excited to be here to talk about the game and the show. So thanks for having us.
Hi everyone, my name is Lisa Lundgren and I am a professor at Utah State University where I study science education. I really look at how people are learning about science and where they're learning about science. Yay! And my connection really to The Last of Us is I'm also enamored with everything nerdy and I've really been trying to play the game, but it's scary. So I had a great time watching the show, but I keep on trying to go back to the game and being like, I can do this. So that's my connection.
Hi everybody, I'm Terry Sant. I'm a professor at San Diego State University. Go Aztecs, this is how I am here. In the School of Public Health, and my expertise is toxicology and environmental health. So I look at how environmental factors influence health and disease. Including environmental toxins, such as those found in fungi, when made by fungi, and water. So I played through both games, watched the show, huge fan, and it was around the time I was finishing my dissertation, so I remember being so compelled, like, oh, look at this ethical public health dilemma as we were playing through, so it was awesome.
Hello everybody, it is so awesome to be here today. My name is Lindsey, Rustad, and I am a forest ecologist with the USDA Forest Service, and I'm stationed in the beautiful White Mountains in New Hampshire, all the way across the country. And I have spent the greater part of the last 3 decades trying to figure out what makes forests tick, and particularly how they respond to and they recover from large-scale disturbances or apocalypses, such as air pollution, climate change, and extreme weather events. In fact, part of my job is to create environmental apocalypses. My most recent one was creating ice storms in the mountains of New Hampshire. So I, in general, don't like apocalyptic shows because it's too close to home for me. But I really, really enjoyed the show, and I can't wait for season 2.
Hi everyone, I'm Ana Maria Porras. I'm a professor of biomedical engineering at the University of Florida. And in my lab, we create mimics of diseased tissues to study interactions between humans and microbes. We have projects that study the bacteria that are in the gut microbiome. We study tropical parasites. Funnily enough, we don't study fungi. But I'm hoping to bring an engineering perspective to what we're going to talk about today. And I left everything at home. It's been a crazy summer, so I didn't have a chance to bring them as props, but I also do a lot of scientific communication using crocheted microbes. So if you find me on social media, you will see them there.
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Earyn McGee, and I am a herpetologist and science communicator. So, thank you. I work at the Los Angeles Zoo as the coordinator for conservation engagement, and so essentially that means that I do conservation research, but also engage communities, especially underrepresented communities, in that conservation work. My background is I was looking at how lizards might be impacted by climate change, and so I do climate change research, ecology research, herpetology, and I'm very excited to talk about some of that natural world impacts on climate change and the things that fungi might have there. So, yeah.
We have an amazing panel of experts today. So why don't we go ahead and push start and get this panel started? Right away, we're gonna get right into it, okay? Justin, as our expert on fungi, could we get a fungal apocalypse? Could Cordyceps start to infect my brain?
This is a super cool question. I think as a mycologist, I was always waiting for something like The Last of Us to come out. And in fact, I think watching some of the background stuff, I remember that the creators, when they watched Planet Earth, which might have been your first introduction to some of these fungi, as it was mine, they were thinking oh, we have to do something with this. So I'd like to begin just by talking about Cordyceps in general. The name you've probably all heard, it's actually a genus of fungi. Fungi are a kingdom of eukaryotes, so they're like us, they're like animals. They're actually more closely related to animals than they are to plants, even though this guy Linnaeus, who originally described fungi, described them as plants, and when you see them, you might think, hey, that kind of looks more like a plant than an animal. The only reason I mention this is because it's cool. Another reason is because when we get to talking about the more details of could this actually happen, and if it does happen, what do we do about it, the fact that fungi are so closely related to animals and humans specifically means that a lot of the things we would try and use to kill them to save ourselves will also hurt us. And so this is one of the reasons why in the show, in addition to the fungus being in the brain, that we can't really do anything about it. It's because if you try and put a chemical or an antibiotic or an antifungal that'll hurt them, it'll likely hurt you as well. So they're fungi, this really cool group of organisms. A lot of people don't know much about fungi. I find in my meanderings, I find that it's easy to think about them as a simple group of things that look like mushrooms, when in fact they have diversity that mirrors more like plants or animals. So if you think about the scale of insects to mammals, that's the kind of diversity we see in fungi as well. And if we divide them into groups like insects and mammals, Cordyceps is in this group called the Ascomycota. It's actually the sister group of mushrooms. So they're actually common. Other Ascomycota that you might be familiar with are plant pathogens. Who likes morel mushrooms? Those are Ascomycetes, despite them being called mushrooms and looking kind of like that. And within the Cordyceps, they're actually spread across multiple different groups. And we only found this out recently when people started really focusing on them because of all this cool stuff like Planet Earth and The Last of Us. And so when you say the word Cordyceps, we're actually talking about members that span 3 different families of fungi. We've come up with all kinds of cool names for them now, and Cordyceps has become kind of like the quote-unquote name for all of them. They're filamentous fungi, so they're not yeast. They reproduce via spores. They don't have dimorphic morphology where they can switch between being a yeast and a filamentous fungus like many human pathogens do. So they're strictly filamentous. They have an asexual and a sexual life cycle, and most of the cool structures that we see when we watch Planet Earth or in The Last of Us are supposed to be these asexual structures that reproduce via asexual spores that are on these highly developed structures, such as the ones that pop out of the ants' heads. What's really interesting is that these fungi that are best known for causing these behavioral changes in things like ants and spiders, now that we've done really cool work on them, we found that they don't actually grow into the brain, or what would be like the brain of those animals. So that means that the signaling that's happening to cause those changes is indirect, it's potentially chemical, something like that. The fungal growth is restricted to muscle tissue, and so that's where we've seen it growing. The group it's mainly popular is called Cordyceps. There's hundreds of species. They infect tons of different insects and also spiders. We'll get into talking about some beneficial fungi later, and we'll revisit some members of this group.
Sweet, thanks, Justin. So, in the show, or in the game too, well, actually, no, sorry, it's still early for me. In the show specifically, they added some extra scenes where they were talking like at the beginning of the infection, and one of the doctors that was on the show, she said that there could be no cure for this because it's a fungal infection. So Carrie, for you, as a toxicologist, someone who works in public health and things like that, is that something that you worry about, like a fungal infection with no cure? Is that plausible?
Well, yeah, it is plausible. So fungal infections are not all that uncommon. Probably most people in this room have had to deal with one at one point or another. Things like athlete's foot, thrush, all of those are all fungal infections. So most fungal infections are actually topical, so they are happening on the skin, etc., but they have a hard time surviving in the human body. And part of that is temperature, but also we're a hostile environment inside. So fungi do not do very well inside the human body. The people that are most susceptible to fungal diseases are typically immunocompromised. So those that are already our most susceptible populations for infections are especially vulnerable to fungal infections. Right now, we have a lot of different types of antibiotics, et cetera, that can be used to treat fungal infections. Again, if you've had one, you've probably dealt with one. But one of the things that happens over time is some of the evolution or resistance that's driven by exposure to all of these antibiotics or antifungal agents. So things that were topical antifungals decades ago are potentially becoming less and less effective at removing the infection from your skin, etc. So this is something that over time and with increased use by everybody does happen normally and naturally. But also there's the aspect of things like fungicides in the environment, etc., that also can be driving those. So in tandem, those are perhaps a sleeping giant that could be eventually becoming more and more difficult to treat over time from a public health perspective. So it is feasible, but there are a lot of great chemists on it, and we keep coming up with a lot of new antibiotics and antifungal agents that are using different mechanisms to target disease over time. So we've been talking a lot about epidemics and pandemics over the past few years. It's been rough in public health, but alas, over time, fungi have been relatively easier to deal with from a human health perspective.
Oh, good. So I don't have to worry about clickers then.
Goodness, I hope not. They're terrifying.
When I played the game, my brother and my mom were like, "Can you not play at night, please?" It would just be like, "Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god." I think in the show it was really cool that they added that. It added not just another level of horror, but just something to think about scientifically. And as in the game and in the show, one of the main elements is Ellie, right? Ellie is potentially the cure. And they need to go get her to Fedra, and they're going to do some experiments on her to figure out the cure. And for Anna, as a biomedical engineer, what would need to go into that to create a cure from a person? Is that something we could do?
Yeah, I think in that case, so as engineers, we usually think about what are the challenges, what are our design constraints, what are the needs that we're trying to meet. So we would, right, some of the constraints have already been mentioned. So the fact that compared to bacteria, there are really only about 4 classes of antifungal medications that we have available. And as was just said, multiple fungi are developing resistance against them. So that's one design constraint, right? Existing medications. Then we don't really have vaccines against fungal infections for many reasons. So we would have to understand what is it about Ellie that makes her immune. Is it her immune system? Is it a genetic mutation that doesn't allow the fungus to bind to one of her cells? And to figure that out, that's what could give us the key. But you can also think about, I think engineering could also come into play in an outbreak like this, because you could also think about opportunities to take on the fungus before it infects people. So figuring out the mode of spread, which was different in the TV show versus in the video game, for example, that would be pretty crucial at understanding that. And another thing that at least would be hard about a fungal outbreak is that we don't have a lot of rapid diagnostic tools for fungi that are specific for fungi. And as we learned in real life, the lack of rapid diagnostic tools is what allows outbreaks to spread very quickly. An additional concern, this is specific in the context of the show. I don't know that if we would have a fungal outbreak that could grow that fast, but a major concern would be that maybe the people that have the expertise to figure it out would die too quickly. That would be my concern. Especially if they're the ones studying the fungus, wouldn't they die the first? So that to me is a big concern. Another thing though that we learned in the pandemic, so I personally think that part of the reason we don't have a lot of solutions for fungi is also because of the lack of funding. So I was doing research recently, and in the a report from about 3 years ago said that in the United States and in the UK, national federal level funding with 4 infectious pathogens and infectious diseases, only 3% of that funding goes towards fungal infections. And so if we learned anything about mRNA vaccines at the speed at which they were developed, it's that when we actually put our money and our resources behind a problem, at least my thinking as an optimistic engineer is that I think we could figure it out. And so I guess in that case, we would actually have resources behind it, and then maybe, yeah, it could eventually work out.
So I'm not really about fear mongering, but you heard Anna, right? So unless you want a fungal apocalypse, give scientists money. Really quick, you brought up a really cool point, Anna. Like with the difference in the game and the show, the game it's all about the spores, right? Like they have to wear the gas mask. Justin, like, would it matter? Would the spores just go everywhere in real life? Or would they actually be contained to a specific room that only loads really slowly?
Really glad you asked this because I think about spores a lot. So spores, like seeds for plants, have a dispersal kernel where they tend to fall. Like if we think about a mushroom, right around the mushroom, they have really cool studies where they tag them with fluorescent dyes and things like that. And you can see they mostly hang out right around where they're from. If you've gone mushroom hunting for mushrooms that grow right on top of each other, you might see the spores on the mushrooms right below them. But there are these rare cases, these tails we call them, in the graphs of how far they disperse, where they can have long distance dispersal events that could be really catastrophic for something like a fungal infective fungus like these cordyceps things.
So, talking about like the infection, The Last of Us is a take on the zombie trope, right? But they gave us a fresh take on it. It's a fungus that happens, and I think one of the things I really love about that zombie trope, when it started with Dawn of the Dead and things, it was a critique on human society, right? We are that infection in a way, right? When they created those zombies, especially in the movie, they're all going to a mall. It's just this really cool take on our society, but. Thinking about it from a science and nature perspective, that brings up a lot more discussions about like how we interact with our environment, right? We are a part of nature. We're not something separate, but The Last of Us does bring up more questions. And I think for Earyn, as our conservationist, when you look at something like The Last of Us, what does that like bring up for you about like, are we actually the infection? Are these apocalypses something that we create and that we should worry about?
Well, the first part of that is, who is we? Because it's not, all of humankind, and I think that really brings in a lot of like nuance of us as a society, and when I say us, I'm talking specifically about Western countries and capitalistic societies, where it's all about, let's be the most efficient so we can make the most money. If you think, so back in the day with Coke, and like they used to have like the Coke bottles, like the glass bottles, and you would drink the Coke and then you would recycle it, and then it would get, sanitized and refilled with Coke, and now you have all these plastic bottles. And so you can't really say, are we the infection, because it's not everybody. It's not people who are, living more sustainably or living, more traditionally, or if you think of like indigenous peoples and things like that. And so it's just kind of like, are we the infection? Some of us, yes. Like some of us definitely have more responsibility than others, and because of the way that we live life, we are definitely causing a lot of climate change, and with climate change and rising of temperatures, we're more likely to come into contact with animals and get zoonotic diseases. And so that's kind of like what happened with this, the COVID pandemic. And so it's not just, viruses, it's also fungi and bacteria and things like that. But if we are, I wouldn't say that we are the infection. I would say that we, participants in capitalism, are the problem, but we can also be the solution if we're brave enough to be able to imagine a different world, a more climate-friendly living experience, and we can work globally potentially to be the solution.
Everyone heard that, right? Good. I think those are really, really great points, and there's so much to talk about when it comes to ecological apocalypses. And you were talking about, that's kind of what you do, Lindsey, that's what you study. And for something like The Last of Us, if that were to occur, or in real life with climate change happening, these apocalypses, what would happen around us? Is that something that's just zero sum game? I don't think that's the right thing I'm looking for. Is that end game? That's what I was trying to say.
I think in my work where I study these large-scale disturbances, we really try to push systems, so maybe not quite to the point of an apocalypse, but push them hard. We acidify them, we drought them, we warm them, we ice them, we do all of these different things. And one of the things I've been most impressed by is how resilient many of our systems. I work in forests, so mature north temperate forests, so I can't speak for all forests. But really how resilient forests are. So one of the things though that we're looking for, that when we're pushing these systems, is when we would see what I would call that state change, right? So if I ice in a forest, how much ice do I have to put? How many trees do I have to bring down so that when it recovers, it doesn't recover to be a forest. It recovers to be maybe a grassland or a wasteland. So what are those tipping points? And those are the sorts of things we're looking at. So we're talking about climate change. How much do we have to warm something or drought something or hurricanes? Or what point do our ecosystems not come back to what they were before? So we have a lot of scientists out there trying to figure that out.
Interesting. I think one of my favorite parts of the game, and they reproduced it so well in the show, was that giraffe scene, right? You're in this cityscape and the plants have just taken over, and then these wildlife which escape the zoo, which could happen here because and the giraffe is just there, and then so Earyn, as a conservationist, I'm sure that the initial stages of the apocalypse would have devastating effects on wildlife, but the recovery that we kind of see, that unique apocalyptic recovery that we see in the show and other types of apocalypses, what do you have to say about that? Is that something that you would maybe hope for?
So when I was watching the show, and I love the show, by the way, I didn't say that in my introduction. I didn't play the game, but I'm trying to get back into video games. But so when I was watching, I was just like, that's really interesting that we don't see any animals being impacted by this, because we know that human diseases can be animal diseases, and so that's why in some zoos or whatever, it was closed, you couldn't, your cat or your dog could get COVID and stuff like that, and then animals could get us disease. So I was just kind of why don't we see any animals having this? And then also a lot of animals do get fungal diseases. So like Justin was mentioning earlier, the zombie ant fungus, and then since I think it's been since 1998, something that's been really big in the herpetological community has been how do you say it, because I can't say that right. No, like the chytrid fungus, that's what I was thinking of, but I didn't know that I couldn't say the full name of it. It's so hard to say. But essentially it's this fungus that impacts amphibians, and it's very easily spread, and because of climate change and rising temperatures, it's only making these amphibians more and more susceptible to this fungi, and so it's probably been the most detrimental thing to our amphibian species populations globally on literally every continent, and it's only getting worse with climate change. And so it's just okay, yeah, some of those animals, some animals might survive, some might do well, some might not do as well as others, some might develop some kind of adaptations, but who's to say, depending on what the fungal infection is. But I do expect to see if it devastates humans so drastically, you guys are not going to have dogs, you're not going to have your cats, you might not have monkeys or something like that, who knows, but there's going to be devastating losses in the animal communities as well.
Can you imagine a clicker dog? I don't think I can do it. I have a corgi, and he became famous as a clicker dog. I was just take me. I can't. I think that's a really cool point, Erin and Lindsey, too. The way we talk about the overlap between our world and this game or show, right? When we look at The Last of Us, it's an amazing story, but I think from the science perspective, we have to look at it as a tale of caution as well, a warning of what could happen. And our job with Cosplay for Science, or as science communicators in general, we pick at those points and we pull at those narrative threads to share with you these amazing science. And there's so much we can learn by pulling at these threads in The Last of Us. And I think one thing that I really find interesting with The Last of Us 2 is that sometimes when we pull those threads, we can go on a whole different tangent, and we can create these misconceptions or bad perceptions about some things. I think The Last of Us might have created an accidental fear of fungi in a lot of people, rightfully so, right? Because if I hear, nope, not doing it. But it does. And Lisa, for you, as a science education expert, the power of pop culture in creating misconceptions, how do we not necessarily combat that, but how do we work with that as science communicators?
That's a really good question. I think about it in terms of, you can think about, okay, I was scared of this thing. How can I think about, is it actually real? I think about this thing called the craft test a lot. And it's really thinking about what's the content, what's the relevancy, what's the accuracy, what's the purpose of the messaging that's trying to happen here, right? And so for TV shows and things like The Last of Us, it's to entertain, right? So it's not to try to educate you, it's not to try to, it can be to scare you, right? Because that's a really big part of this really cool TV show, is to be oh my gosh, I'm on the edge of my seat, it's a thriller. And so it's to really think through what's the messaging and why is the thing that's being told me being told. So it's really thinking through in that sort of perspective, I would say.
Awesome. I love fungi. I've really learned to love mushrooms through the pandemic, because with most of us, we picked up brand new hobbies, and I have tons of mushroom books now. And so I think, there's so much cool things about fungi and mushrooms that we can learn about. I think one of my favorite ones, Lindsey, especially I want to talk to you about this one, is the importance of fungi actually for trees and forests. There's this whole actual fungal web that is unseen. Can you share a little bit more of that? Because it does connect to the show. That's how the Cordyceps talk to each other in a weird way.
Well, I am so glad I get this question, because one of the things that horrified me about the show, particularly the first couple of episodes, was not the fungal hyphae coming out of people's mouths or bursting out of their brains, but the fact that the infected and the fungi were the bad guys, right? They were the evil. So I've studied forests and forest soils for over 3 decades, and fungi have always been the heroes of the forest. And just to share with you a couple of the things that they do, so they play a major role in decomposing organic matter. So think of logs and branches and leaves and animals. That material has to be decomposed so its carbon and nutrients can be recycled and used over and over and over again. And fungi play a super important role in doing that. Also, you mentioned the mushrooms. So we see just the very tip of the fruiting bodies of the fungus, but they produce this incredible volume of what we call biomass below ground with the mycelium and going throughout the ground. So they store an incredible amount of carbon underground. And if that carbon is underground, guess what? It's not in the air. So they're actually helping protect us from global climate change and helping to mitigate against global climate change. Another thing, they secrete all this gooey substance, and you go, ew, what's that? But that gooey substance and the hyphae actually serves to bind together little soil particles into bigger aggregates. And these aggregates in soil help store water, they help protect carbon, they help stabilize the soil. And then the last thing, and I think you were talking a little bit about this, they form these amazing connections with trees. And these are called mycorrhizal fungi. Myco is for fungus, rhizal, of course, is for roots. And these are symbiotic relationships where the trees, right, they're photosynthesizing, they're grabbing carbon out of the air, they shunt it to the roots who share it with these fungi. Meanwhile, the fungi are putting their hyphae out and they're taking up water and nutrients and they're sharing it with the roots, which are sharing it with the trees. So I think of kind of carbon going from the trees down to the roots to the fungi, and then nutrients and water going from the fungi to the roots up to the trees, and this beautiful kind of dance and balance. One other thing I did want to say, there are various types of mycorrhizae, but one thing they have in common is they actually change the form and function of tree roots. So if you look at a mycorrhizal root and a non-mycorrhizal root, they look different. So if you think of the movie, right, the fungus changed the form and function of humans, right? They created the expanded heads and the clickers and changed the function so they were very aggressive. Well, they're doing that not like ants, but they are changing the form and function of tree roots. So anyway, in my book, fungi are the heroes.
Gabe, is it okay if I
Absolutely.
add something real quick? So I just wanted to say, we just talked about it from the perspective of the forest, but as I mentioned earlier, in my lab we study the microbiome, which is all the microorganisms that are with you in your body, every surface that comes in touch with the outside world. And fungi are also part of our healthy microbiomes. And we don't understand, as I was saying before, due to lack of funding, usually you hear a lot about the microbiome and you're really hearing more about bacteria in the microbiome, but fungi are also part of our normal human ecosystem. We don't understand as much about them, but that's in the process of changing. So that's another way in which we're already living day to day with fungi. We're just not aware of it.
We're changing our perceptions of this, right? That's so cool. Like, I especially love that the way that the writers, again, who created this world for us, they took something from the real world and like wove it into this cool narrative for the show of like, when Joel accidentally like stepped on the mycorrhizae. Is that what I said? The network?
The fungus, the hyphae.
Hyphae, that's
the
right.
mycelium.
Yes.
Many words too.
I'm a paleontologist. Everything I study is dead. But I love the way that they did that as a way to send the signal. I remember I knew a little bit and I watched that. I was like, my roommates are scientists too, but we're all like, oh, we know what that is. So again, it's just really cool to bring that up. Justin, as our mycologist fungi expert, is there any kind of like other cool fungi facts you want to share with us?
Yeah, so I just have to agree that even fungal pathogens are usually helpful. It sucks to have an infection as an individual, but usually at like higher levels, population and community, it's weeding out things that are becoming too dominant. And even with cordyceps that infect insects, they usually only infect less than 10% of the population at any given time. And so it's interesting to think about that concept from The Last of Us, like why is this happening? Maybe thinking about are humans the problem? But on a lighter note, I mentioned earlier how fungi are super diverse, which makes them awesome. There are actually other species of cordyceps that have been found to have beneficial medical effects. So there is one species of Ophiocordyceps that colonizes ghost moth caterpillars, that the fungus insect husk, so similar to like the root fungus thing that we were just talking about, the fungus insect thing, is a prized tradition in Chinese medicine, and that's becoming more popular in the Western world. There's Cordyceps militaris, which is actually the type species, so like the first one that we described for the group, that improves learning and memory in mice, so eventually we'll see if that works in humans. And then there's just lots of other groups of fungi that are generally helpful. So there's fungi that live in the leaves of plants that do similar things as the ones that live in the roots. There are lichens that you may know about. There are symbiosis between fungi and photosynthetic organisms. There are yeasts that we all love if you like fermented things. And so, yeah, I would agree that fungi are usually doing good things. If there's something out there that can be done, there's a fungus that can do it. So yeah.
Carrie, you have something right?
You as a toxicologist, naturally, I'm always talking about bad things that fungi get to do, right? But one of the aspects is that not just because it's bad to maybe something doesn't mean it's bad to everything. So a lot of even pesticides that are natural that we use are actually derived in part from fungal toxins. So that we have a lot of really natural benefits from having them in our environment as well, in addition to obviously everything we've talked about so far.
So Lisa, you had a question you wanted to actually ask us, right?
Yeah, like before we get to our whole question and answer piece, I just kind of wanted to ask the other panelists a little bit about, so if we're thinking about how you got into The Last of Us and then how other people might get into other things that are similar to The Last of Us, you know, if you have a love for The Last of Us and this idea of fungi, are there other games or pop culture aspects or things that you would suggest that me or the other people in the audience could maybe explore?
I know for me, one of the influential movies or stories is Nausicaa, Valley of the Wind from Studio Ghibli. Yes, right? Amazing. And I think that's such a beautiful story about conservation, about the way that we engage with the world. And it's all about those mushrooms and the spores. And it's so beautifully woven together that when I first watched it, I had no idea I was watching a story about ecology and conservation. And then as I got older and I went to school, I was listening to a lecture and something snapped. I was like, oh, I know where that's from. And I went home and watched the movie and I was like, I love this even more. So if you've never seen it, watch it. And if you haven't seen it recently, knowing the knowledge you got today, watch it again.
And I guess I'll just add for me, I really got into mycology through foraging for edible mushrooms. So if you like cooking or if you just like being in the woods, it's a really fun hobby and can be a really interesting thing to keep you busy in your spare time.
If you're really into eco-apocalypse, I'm sure a lot of people played this one too, but Horizon Zero Dawn brought up obviously us as kind of the issue in the environment and adaptation post-apocalypse as well.
And I have to mention Don't Look Up, right? We're talking about climate change.
I think for me, I read a lot of books and I'm blanking and my phone is uploading very slowly. I'm blanking on the actual name of this book. I think it's maybe All the Men Are Gone or No Men Left. I don't remember, but it is about this virus. I think it's a virus that kills all men.
Is that Why the
all
Last
by
Man?
5%. And it's a super interesting book. What did you say?
Was that Why the Last Man?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. That's the right name of the book. Anyways, it's a really fascinating take on what would happen if half the population. It's very sad, so a little bit of trigger warning. That's interesting. And then I always really love playing Pandemic, the board game. It's a really popular one, but it's a fun one.
Fights, for sure. Erin?
Mine's not pandemic or apocalyptic related. But for me, it was Pokemon. So like I mentioned that I don't really play a whole lot of video games, but that is the one game that I will play in completion, and I will do the DLC and stuff like that for it. And even as a kid, like I was always playing Pokemon, and because like for my job, I always wanted to work with animals, and so like when I went to undergrad and grad school, people like paid me to go out into the field for 4 to 6 weeks into the summer, and all I did was catch lizards all day, every day. So you know, I ended up catching them all.
I'm just gonna do a quick plug before we do questions. Erin and I were at Los Angeles Comic-Con last winter, and we did a natural history and Pokemon panel, and so that's on YouTube if you want to check it out on Cosplay for Science. All right, question time.
Okay, so
Hello.
Planes were science fiction. Pandemic was science fiction. AI was science fiction. It seems like we don't know. Should I start again?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so things that I've been thinking about was that submarines went sci-fi, planes were sci-fi, pandemic was sci-fi, AI was sci-fi, and here we are. Why these things are happening, and when are we going to start taking science fiction seriously? Sorry.
So I actually was thinking something about that. So I'm kind of known as a Pollyanna with people that I work with that I think, positively. But with The Last of Us, it actually awoke in me an idea of, oh my goodness, what would happen if things went wildly out of balance? Not with the human, fungus, but in our ecosystems. And so this is a case where pop culture and the science fiction actually changed the way I, as a scientist, am thinking about fungi in the forest. I still think they're heroes, but now I'm just a little bit more cautious about them.
I mean, to me, you describe it as the Thanos of nature, more than a hero.
So our next question is from Albert, and I'm going to ask you guys all to try to keep it as short as you can so we can get through it.
Hello, how are y'all doing? So earlier you touched on the differences between the video game and the show that came to life, of course, different writer discussions. So I wanted to ask you, as experts on, subjects like microbes, the different types and effects of fungi, and the overall impacts of climate change that you've observed, what are some, fascinating real-life concepts that you would want to see incorporated in the show or future games, right? Like from your studies and observations over the years.
One thing that I was just thinking about in my answer, and this was, I thought about this as Justin was speaking. I was thinking about what if Ellie is immune because her microbiome produces something that kills the fungus in her body. So that made me think about how my research could maybe intersect with what's happening in the show. It's a great question.
Okay, and then this is Kaz, also known as Nathan.
Kaz Brecker, Six of Curtis. So I feel like biodiversity is really understated, whether it's economically or how it plays a role in science, and so I'm super curious how fungal biodiversity plays a role in each of your niches of work.
I guess I can start if you don't mind. So I actually study fungal systematics and fungal diversity, so it impacts me pretty directly. I can give you numbers if you want.
I can speak a little bit on it. So actually, shout out to my internship students at the LA Zoo, because I do have a group looking at fungi across these two areas of undeveloped land in the zoo that we're looking to restore. And so we have native oak trees and invasive eucalyptus trees. And so we're part of what we're interested in is what does the mycorrhizome and soil fungi and bacteria look like based on what trees we have present in different areas.
So such a great question. We all love this question on biodiversity. So one of the things I think about in forests, fungi, we have an estimate that we only know about 10% of the species that are out there. So that means there's 90% or plus minus species we don't know anything about, and we're likely to lose some of these, that they'll go extinct before we ever know anything about them. So I think there is a push to try to better understand the biodiversity of fungi in human and natural systems.
Cool. Next question.
Okay, we have Angel.
Hello. I wanted to touch on your mention of how pop culture influences society. The Last of Us introduces the sphere of fungi, but do you think it will also inspire folks to better understand the phenomenon? Phrased another way, do you think curiosity will trump fear, and the show will inspire more interest in science in the younger generation?
100%. Obviously, like, judging from the fact that all of you are here and you're probably going to go tell your friends about your experience at this panel, I hope, that this is a really good way to inspire curiosity and conversations versus fear of fungi, right? Like, this is a really great opportunity, so I really appreciate The Last of Us for showing what fungi can do, and that we have people who can study it and tell us a little bit more about it too.
People bring it up in our public health classes. Like, honestly, like, people show up to class and say, I got into this because of The Last of Us. So it's working.
Hi. So my question was more, what kind of fungi do you think will be responsible for The Last of Us type of outbreak? Or would it be like an unholy combination of multiples, such as the zombie ant virus mixed with the white nose syndrome is back?
So personally, I think we should be more wary of fungi that are affecting our crops than we are about us. So there's fusarium fungi that affect bananas. In my state of Florida, there's a fungus that's ravaging, going through all of the citrus crops. I think that's what we should be more worried on.
Last question.
This is Michael.
With the examples of parasites like T. gondii causing toxoplasmosis and S. solidus, which affects birds and fish behavior, how possible is a widespread behavior-altering infection in humans?
I can comment on that. It's compared to plenty of other types of pathogens, a little bit weaker argument for it, but like Justin said, it could be an indirect effect where there's an infection that colonizes and then some sort of toxin is secreted that then infiltrates the blood and goes to the brain. So something like that could be definitely feasible, but just something that's a direct effect is a lot less likely than bacteria, for example.
All right, so we could talk about this all day, but we only have less than 30 seconds. So I just want to say thank you all so much for coming to our panel. We really appreciate it. Round of applause for our amazing panelists. So we are Cosplay for Science. Please follow us online. We're going to be outside of the panel for a few minutes after if you want to chat with us more. But please come find us at the STEAM Fair at the Comic-Con Museum Friday through Sunday. All of our If Then ambassadors and our Cosplay for Scientists are there talking about questions. We have our Dungeons & Dragons Natural History Museum. So please come find us. Thank you all so much.